Okay, Geoff, thank you for joining this panel. We really appreciate it. I think you and I are both members of very large national and international law firms with wide experience in many sectors of the economy and many types of legal and social problems. So I think that gives us a unique opportunity to have a discussion about how large institutions, and in this case, large companies, operate. So the basic thesis that I wished to discuss with you, and I hope you can comment on, is that my thesis is that companies that abide by good governance, ethical standards, the rule of law, and have diverse management and employee base tend to be the ones that succeed well. And I think the empirical evidence shows it. From your experience in advising large companies and perhaps being on the boards of some, how do you see that thesis?
So firstly, I think that's wise, and it's especially wise over the long term. I think what I would say, Javed, is that if you look at leaders in business who look over the long time horizon of themselves and the next generation of leaders, they know that looking at the ethics dimension, dishonesty may be profitable in the short run, but it's disastrous in the long run. And that has become ever more so because of the work of international lawyers who have passed a network of laws against corruption of foreign officers, legislation in Canada and elsewhere. In my own practice, I've seen that have a profound effect on international business, where businesses that had thrived on dishonest practices in bidding and obtaining contracts have now found that that was a short-term success. And so I'm optimistic, actually, that a international level of honesty, minimum honesty in contracts and contracting will drive more economic efficiency, and it will mean that businesses will succeed if they adhere to those levels of honesty and transparency.
No, that's certainly my own experience. How about, and I think I know you've spoken to me about this before, kind of the combination of good governance, ethics in general, beyond people, being engaged in corruption, and diversity in companies. What's been your experience with that?
Well, firstly, I think we're at a very unique moment again in this, in that there's a huge cry for progress. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to make the next generation of progress in these areas. I think the first thing that we can learn from the past is let's not pretend it's easy. I think there's a tendency, rhetorically and otherwise, to say, if everybody would just agree with me, we could wake up tomorrow morning and the world would be a better place. Progress is never that easy. If you look back over the last 40 years, progress has come in fits and starts. It's not always one direction. And so realizing that these things aren't easy, either because people can be challenging, but also the subject matters can be challenging. The example I give is the wave of it on the ethical side, the wave of law, which meant that public authorities had to accept the lowest bid, which was intended to drive out dishonesty in contracting. Well, it had the unintended effect of bankrupting vertical construction firms, because the law of the optimistic bidder basically meant that they eventually lost money because too many projects would have unexpected risks attached to them. And we've had to go through now 2 or 3 generations to try to cope with the fact that just being required to take the lowest bid has unintended negative economic consequences. I think the other examples I've given of things that aren't easy, which are more on the human rights side, I was phoned by the prison doctor in a prison saying that the prison had shut down their baby in prison program. Could I take action under our Canadian Constitution to reopen it? And I thought, well, that'll take me a few weeks. I'm sure the prison officials will see my way and see the way of the doctor, and we'll get that done quickly. So, 6 years later, in a 6-week trial with 20 expert witnesses, we ended up succeeding at the trial. But it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. I was involved in the new Canadian Constitution in advocating in the courts for the rights of immigrants who were not yet citizens to hold jobs. And that right was not expressly protected in our new constitution, which was just passed in 1982. And eventually we were able to persuade the Supreme Court of Canada that they ought to have similar rights because they had similar issues and needs to the other protected area peoples and groups under the Constitution. But that ended up being a 5-year battle and not a 2-week battle or a 3-week battle. So these things aren't easy. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I do think we have to remember how much progress we've made, and I would fight for this. I think the rhetoric often is, we shouldn't have to do this. Well, we do have to do this. Every generation has to advance itself and also remember the history. I mean, we have made a huge amount of progress in this area. Look at the people I'm talking to. 40 years ago, we would be saying, geez, wouldn't it be nice to have a Mr. Chowdhury in the conversation? Wouldn't it be nice to have a Mrs. Chowdhury in the conversation? And we have a diversity of people in the conversation today that was really almost the subject of dreams 40, 50 years ago in my parents' generation. So there has been a lot of progress. And I think learning how we made that progress and celebrating that progress as well as taking on the next challenges is important.
No, I must agree with you completely, Geoff. Occasionally we can all be, pessimists about these things. One thing I wanted to ask you is that, in my years, both as a general counsel for about 15 years and then as a lawyer for private law firm, I have found that the pressures created by bad behavior has an effect. And so I also have known from my experience with investors who came to speak to us on various things, that if we demonstrated good ethics, and by the way, that was recognized by independent organizations, all that actually helped the perspective of the investment community. They wanted to invest in your company because they trusted the management. They trusted the management to be transparent. They trusted the management to say, yep, look, these are not easy issues, but we are working to fix them. What's your experience been both north or south of the border?
Well, I'd say two things. Firstly, I think all progress eventually transforms culture, and culture is the real victory, right? I think I remember somebody telling me that when they went into a law firm, Javed, they could tell within the first 5 minutes what that law firm was like based upon how the receptionist greeted them, what the flavor of the firm was like. And that's just, we're culture understanding creatures. And that's true for people in the firm as well as outside the firm. It's true for people in companies and outside the companies. And it's the culture which drives behavior. It's the culture which puts incentives in front of people. It puts positive incentives and negative incentives. It's the culture that celebrates success, what kinds of success it celebrates. So from my perspective, I think we have to recognize that's the ultimate goal, is to transform culture. That's where we've made progress. The law can lead culture, it can shape culture, and so can internal policies. But I think if you recognize that we have to change culture, then I think we're on to the right thing. If you take your example, I think I'm going to translate it into a really practical economic things. If you can't trust the numbers, right?
Yes.
If you can't trust the numbers, then you don't know what you're doing. And in any modern world, you need to be able to trust the numbers. That's one of the great advantages North American businesses have. I think we have a more robust numbers than pretty much anywhere else. I think cultures have traditionally tended to tolerate uncertainty and vagueness in the numbers. And I think driving true, transparent, reliable numbers allows the market forces to work in their best way possible. And a culture that says we above all will produce accurate numbers is going to be in the long run more successful.
I think that's exactly right. I was going to note to pick up on your point that, there are companies where the management sits sort of in an ivory tower and not very well connected to the employee base. And I think that in my own experience, again, in-house or as an outside advisor, the management teams which collaborated very intimately with the various layers of employees, and where there were easy ways for people to put up their hand, and raise issues were the ones that succeeded the most. And the reason, of course, is that every institution, every organization has problems. And the trick is to identify them, be honest about them, and then proceed to fix them. And I imagine that's your experience.
So there's an example, I think, of being able to celebrate progress. If you look over the last 40 years, organizations have become flatter than they were before. The degree of pyramidical thinking 40
Yes.
years ago was extraordinary. The CEO was way away from everybody else. Now, partly as a result of transformations in technology, transformations in the culture driven by technology companies, a CEO can't afford to be that. And I think that's positive. But coming back to your point, businesses that are effective are businesses where the distance between leaders and others in the company is smaller, and that the barriers to communication are lower. One thing I would say about transforming culture for those of us who are interested in making the next steps in respects of ethics and diversity and caring for others is to recruit CEOs and people in leadership effectively. In other words, recruit allies rather than enemies. And I think there are people wanting to be allies who are a bit fearful of walking into the room and not getting the language right, not expressing the right ideas. And I think we have to be generous with one another in business. I think we have to say we have a common cause in these things. We have a common hope for progress, and we have a common hope for changing in our culture that's going to be positive and enable the businesses and organizations to thrive and prosper. If we're not commonly pursuing a goal where the organization as a whole is prosperous and thriving and a good place to work and live, then I think we're not going to be as successful as otherwise.
I couldn't agree more. I would say that this point that you make about culture is so important and so profound. And I suppose in some ways I would say that North American companies, maybe I'm less familiar with some European companies, for example, but have done a reasonably good job with that. So if you look at some of the household names around North America, those companies often have CEOs with names like yours and mine, meaning they aren't necessarily from the traditional sort of landed gentry. What's your experience with companies in other parts of the world?
Well, I think the cultures are quite specific. I think countries in other parts of the world have lower diversity in part because the people they draw from have lower diversity. If you go to Africa, most people in the company are Africans, and in parts of Africa, although Africa, as you know, is a astonishingly diverse continent with 54 countries, so you shouldn't speak about it as one sort of monolithic culture. But I think there's less diversity. I think what we have to recognize is that North America is sort of an unusual place, because this is a place, and I say this of Canada, where everybody has arrived from somewhere else, whether it was one generation ago or many generations ago. And so we should remember when we're dealing with the rest of the world that it's not uncommon to find that there's less diversity in the sense of businesses and organizations because they've come through generations of it. Having said that, usually when you lift up the appearances, you find underneath a hugely greater amount of diversity than you would have otherwise thought, because you just don't get it because you're seeing it from a distance. So I think it's a common experience of humanity that essentially what happens is people have a tension between grouping amongst people that they feel comfortable with, either because they share a race, a religion, a culture, or otherwise, and then benefiting from the fact that if they cross the bridges and they connect with the skills of other cultures and other races and other genders, that collectively that's a more creative, collaborative, innovative organization. So those two tensions, I think, are a healthy tension, but we have to recognize that human social animals, our default is actually not to be diverse. Our default is actually to be more comfortable with people who look and feel like us. But the positive feature is I think we're more productive if we get together across those barriers.
Quite right. I have to say that you have used the 40 years expression a couple of times. I'm now in my 40th year as a lawyer, and I would agree with you that we have a ways to go, but so much progress in those 4 decades for which we can be grateful, and it is part of the unique, diverse culture of North America. But I'm going to switch and ask you one final, very important question to which you do not have to answer, which is, we know your father was a great fast bowler. For those of you listening, that's cricket, by the way. Are you able to do anything along the same lines?
No, I can only watch cricket with unclear understanding, but admiration from a distance. But I can pretend to, at one point, be able to hit a baseball.
Well, let me ask you the final sort of subset then. If we were to go to a cricket match together, and I said that was a dusra, a tisra, a googly, would you know what I was talking about?
I get the googly, because once having heard what a googly is, one never forgets it.
Yes, actually, dusras and tisras are variations on a theme. And I think with that, we can turn this back to Bashir, who actually is a real cricketer.